In 1745, colonial America was a land of uncertainty, lawlessness, and ambition. It was within this chaotic and ever-shifting landscape that Jonas Creighton, a 12-year-old boy from the outskirts of New Haven, emerged as an unlikely figure of both admiration and dread. His brilliance was unmistakable even from a young age. By 7, he could recite the entirety of Plutarch's Lives and had committed to memory several military treatises, some of which were not even available in the colonies but had been sent to him by a mysterious benefactor from England. The townsfolk initially saw him as a gift from God, a shining example of New England's promise and the intellectual future of the colonies. However, beneath his cherubic face and genteel manners, something far darker simmered: a cold, analytical mind that seemed unable or unwilling to grasp the moral limits of its own power. Jonas was born during a particularly tense period in American colonial history, when British and French forces were skirmishing for dominance, and Native American tribes were caught in the middle or used as pawns by both sides. From the age of 9, Jonas began crafting small wooden models of battlefields in his attic. He would use carved figurines to reenact historical military campaigns, altering the outcomes based on what he considered more efficient methods. His strategies were unerringly precise, and when his father, a veteran of the King George's War, saw these reenactments, he was both horrified and impressed. The boy's knowledge of military formations, siege tactics, and psychological warfare rivaled that of trained officers, and he had never once stepped onto an actual battlefield. Jonas didn't play like other children. He strategized. He issued commands. He analyzed the weaknesses of imaginary foes and adjusted his plans with chilling detachment. By the time he was 11, Jonas had attracted the attention of local militia leaders, many of whom were desperate for guidance amid escalating skirmishes near the frontier. At first, it was all theoretical. They asked him for advice, and he provided it with uncanny clarity. He could predict the movements of enemy forces based on seemingly insignificant details such as the weather, terrain, and reports of animal migration. His reputation grew quickly, and some even began calling him the boy tactician or the little general. It wasn't long before Jonas's ideas were not just being discussed, they were being implemented. And when they worked, his influence deepened. What began as tactical suggestions soon turned into direct control. Jonas would write letters to militia captains, signing them with a wax seal he had crafted himself, bearing the image of a blindfolded angel holding scales tipped by a sword. In these letters, he gave detailed orders when to attack, how to flank, which villages to burn and which to spare. At first, some captains hesitated, amused, or uneasy about taking direction from a child, but Jonas had a way of persuading them. He sent precise diagrams, references to classical strategies, and even moral justifications couched in religious language. He framed his actions as necessary for the salvation of the colonies, invoking providence and manifest destiny as his guiding principles. Soon, entire militia units began operating as extensions of his mind, and though they had never met him, many believed he had divine insight. After all, every time they followed his orders, they won. The blood began to flow in earnest that spring. A series of raids in the Hudson Valley left several French-Canadian settlements completely annihilated. Survivors claimed that the attacks had been disturbingly efficient: buildings burned in a sequence designed to trap fleeing civilians, supply routes were severed before they could be used, and soldiers reported hearing a boy's voice issuing commands from beneath a heavy cloak, standing atop a hill, surveying the carnage with binoculars. Though these accounts were initially dismissed as hysteria, the consistency of the descriptions raised questions. How could a child orchestrate such devastation? Who was giving the orders behind the scenes? Jonas, meanwhile, remained at home in New Haven, never lifting a musket or setting foot in the mud of a battlefield. Instead, he sat in his candle-lit attic, surrounded by maps and miniature figurines, carefully moving pieces on a chessboard that spanned hundreds of miles. His journals from this period, which would later be recovered, reveal a mind devoid of emotional attachment. He wrote of villages and towns not as places filled with people but as data points, obstacles, or strategic opportunities. He referred to humans as variables, and death as necessary statistical loss. His language was clinical, surgical, and deeply disturbing. Nowhere in his pages did he mention the faces of the dead, the screams of the wounded, or the mourning of survivors. Only numbers. Only outcomes. As the victories stacked up and colonial governors began to inquire into the source of these military successes, whispers about the boy behind the curtain began to circulate more widely. Some called him a prophet. Others said he was possessed. A few, mostly those who had lost loved ones in the wake of his strategies, began calling him a murderer. Then came the turning point, the incident at St. Lucie. In one of the bloodiest massacres of the war, over 300 civilians were slaughtered, many of them burned alive when their chapel was intentionally set ablaze during Sunday service. The tactic had been outlined in a letter attributed to Jonas Creighton, recommending it as a method of concentrated neutralization. When the letter was intercepted and traced back to New Haven, public outrage exploded. The idea that a child had issued such a command was unthinkable, yet the evidence was undeniable. Militia leaders scrambled to disassociate themselves, claiming they had been misled or coerced. Some destroyed correspondence. Others went into hiding. But Jonas made no effort to flee. When authorities came to arrest him, they found him calmly writing another letter, surrounded by burning candles and a scale model of the colonies. He offered no resistance. In fact, he seemed almost amused. During his trial, he spoke eloquently and without remorse. He explained his actions using philosophical arguments, citing Machiavelli, Augustine, and even obscure German theologians. He said he believed in order, in destiny, and in the right of the superior mind to decide outcomes for the inferior masses. His tone was not boastful but matter of fact, as though he were explaining a theorem or conducting a lecture on ethics. The court sat in stunned silence as Jonas, barely taller than the witness box, detailed the reasons why some villages had to be erased, why certain bloodlines posed threats to the future, and how mercy was often the enemy of progress. The early days of Jonas Creighton's rise to infamy were shrouded in an aura of genius, as well as a lingering sense of something not quite right. In the small town of New Haven, people whispered about the boy with the unnerving eyes that rarely blinked and seemed to scan people as though he were cataloging their weaknesses. His reputation had grown not from any violent outburst or strange behavior, but from his ability to make predictions, eerily accurate ones, about nearby militia conflicts and enemy movements. At first, it was passed off as coincidence. When a local regiment survived an ambush thanks to a route suggested by Jonas, it was chalked up to dumb luck. When he accurately predicted the location of a French artillery cache based on smoke trails and wind direction, it began to feel less accidental. By the time entire companies of soldiers started reporting that the young boy's advice letters had become their unofficial battle manuals, the town was divided. Some praised him as a savant touched by divine insight. Others muttered about demonic possession, dark omens, or worse. Jonas, for his part, maintained the same detached demeanor through it all. He neither relished the attention nor recoiled from it. When questioned, he would reply calmly, with vocabulary and composure far beyond his age. His family, particularly his mother, appeared dazed by his intellectual intensity. She would sit in the pews during Sunday Mass, nervously twisting her apron as parishioners leaned in to question her about her son's latest predictions. Jonas's father had once been proud of his son's gifts, but that pride had curdled into quiet dread after finding a notebook filled with diagrams of perfect destruction patterns, methods to raise entire towns with the fewest number of men, including detailed routes for efficient escape. The handwriting was neat, the language methodical. It read more like a ledger than a journal. The real shift began when survivors of attacks started to describe not just military efficiency, but psychological manipulation. One account from a young French woman claimed that before her village was attacked, someone had left a letter nailed to the church door. The note listed the names of the town's leaders and their respective sins: gossip, theft, adultery, cowardice. It warned of a cleansing. It ended with a symbol, a blindfolded angel tipping a sword into a scale. That symbol was later found carved into trees near other destroyed settlements. Survivors from a nearby fort claimed that enemy forces had spread rumors of supernatural vengeance days before the attacks, demoralizing defenders and causing them to abandon their posts. These tactics were not only effective but theatrical, almost ceremonial. When investigators began connecting the dots, they realized that these psychological patterns matched the style and tone of Jonas's private writings, particularly those found in his Book of Corrections, a homemade volume he had bound himself using foxhide and twine. Inside were passages not just about war, but about punishment, control, and purification. What unsettled people the most wasn't the scale of the violence, but the precision of it. Settlements weren't randomly attacked. Each seemed to be chosen for a reason: its strategic value, its population makeup, or, more disturbingly, the moral reputations of its inhabitants. Jonas had an extensive network of informants, many of them unaware they were feeding information to him. He would send friendly letters to children in other towns, filled with riddles and games, but subtly asking about local leaders, guards, food stores, or superstitions. He sent out books with hollowed-out pages, containing hidden instructions for messengers who never knew the full scope of their task. He manipulated those around him as easily as moving pieces on a chessboard, hiding behind the innocent face of a boy and the assumption that no child could possibly be capable of such machinations. Despite his age, Jonas wielded a chilling kind of charisma. When he did speak publicly, which was rare, his words carried weight. He often spoke in biblical cadence, referencing the Old Testament and drawing parallels between himself and divine judgment. He claimed to be a vessel for greater forces that had grown tired of mankind's foolishness and cowardice. In one known address to a group of armed men preparing for a raid, Jonas said, "If a fire must cleanse the forest, let it be guided by a steady hand, not by chance. We are not butchers. We are instruments of order." The speech was recorded in a diary by one of the men, who later burned down a settlement of nearly 100 people before hanging himself with a note that simply read, "He made me see." By the time the colonial leadership had realized what was happening, it was too late. Jonas's influence had spread through letters, diagrams, intercepted messages, and even coded Bible verses. Soldiers followed orders without knowing their source. Some militia leaders claimed that they received instructions through anonymous notes left in locked boxes at the edge of their camps. Others believed they had received dreams, divinely inspired, only to later discover they had been manipulated by herbs Jonas had instructed others to burn near the campfires, hallucinogenic combinations meant to induce visions. Jonas understood not only warfare but the fragility of the human mind. He broke people before the first shot was fired. As the number of attacks increased, some militia members began to suspect a singular guiding hand behind the operations. The consistency in strategy, the repetition of certain symbolic acts, and the calculated use of fear and misinformation couldn't be coincidence. But no one wanted to admit they had been following a child. It wasn't until a series of intercepted letters each bearing the same handwriting, the same blindfolded angel seal, and the same tactical genius were matched to papers found in Jonas's home that the truth became undeniable. The young boy, now barely 12, had orchestrated more than a dozen raids, resulting in the deaths of hundreds, all without stepping foot outside his town. When officials came for him, they expected a weeping, broken child. Instead, they found Jonas sitting calmly at a desk, dipping a quill into ink and continuing to write, even as the door burst open. He looked up, offered them seats, and asked if they had come to learn. They did not find weapons or tools of violence in his room, only maps, books, and letters written in several languages. One wall was covered in parchment with what appeared to be calculations of loss versus gain, written like a merchant's ledger but referencing lives, towns, crops, and rivers. On a table sat a scale, the same one he had used as the inspiration for his symbol. One side of the scale held a pile of dirt. The other, a feather. When asked what it meant, he responded, "The weight of mercy." No one understood what he meant by that, but it chilled them nonetheless. Jonas Creighton's trial in 1745 would become one of the most controversial proceedings in colonial American history, not simply because of his age, but because of the unsettling clarity and conviction with which he defended himself. The courtroom was packed with townsfolk, militia officers, church leaders, and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the boy who had somehow orchestrated acts of war without ever holding a weapon. He was brought in wearing a modest brown coat, his hands bound not with chains, but with leather straps, an unspoken acknowledgement of his youth. But from the moment he took the stand, any illusions of innocence quickly vanished. His demeanor was calm, collected, and frighteningly self-assured. When the charges were read aloud, multiple counts of conspiracy, mass murder, incitement of violence, and manipulation of military forces, he did not flinch. Instead, he simply asked if he could clarify the term conspiracy, as he believed the word mischaracterized his actions. What followed was not a defense in the traditional sense, but a philosophical dissection of morality, duty, and human weakness. Jonas didn't deny the deaths. He didn't claim coercion, or miscommunication, or even immaturity. He took full credit, laying out the framework for his decisions with the same precision he had used to plan the massacres. He described the towns as weak points in the colonial body, comparing them to infected wounds that required surgical removal. He spoke of balance, of symmetry, and of order. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as this boy, barely able to see over the lectern, detailed how he had come to see himself not as a child, but as a necessary tool of justice. He believed God had gifted him the mind to see patterns others could not, to understand that chaos could only be answered with deliberate and calculated action. The prosecutor attempted to break through Jonas's eerie calm by presenting evidence of the destruction his plans had wrought: burned villages, murdered civilians, families torn apart. But Jonas remained unmoved. He listened, occasionally nodding, and then countered each argument not with excuses, but with what he called context. He asked the court how many lives had been saved by ending a conflict swiftly. He cited passages from ancient texts, likening his actions to those of generals and kings whose decisions had shaped empires. He reminded them that morality was often written after the fact, by the victors, and that if he had been older, in uniform, and successful on the battlefield, he might be called a hero instead of a criminal. What disturbed many observers was the ease with which Jonas wove scripture into his rationale. He quoted from the book of Isaiah, referencing the idea of being chosen to level the high places and cut down the proud. He likened himself to an Old Testament prophet, one who had been given the burden of judgment. Some witnesses reported feeling ill during the proceedings, not from the content of the trial, but from the way Jonas spoke, as if he truly believed he had done something righteous. It was as though he had constructed an entire theology around his own intellect and placed himself at the center of it. Witnesses were brought forward, some of them militia members who had unknowingly carried out Jonas's strategies. Many looked ashamed, but others admitted they had followed the boy's advice because it worked. One officer broke down in tears on the stand, confessing that Jonas's letters had felt more like commandments than suggestions. He described a moment before an attack where he had hesitated, unsure if the plan was morally sound, but then he recalled Jonas's words, "A moment's doubt may cost a century of peace." He had gone through with the assault, and the enemy had been crushed. He said he had never slept properly since. Jonas was given the opportunity to speak directly to the court before sentencing. He used it not to plead for mercy, but to issue a final analysis of human nature. He said that people feared intelligence when it lacked sentimentality. That the moment logic divorced itself from emotion, society recoiled. But, he argued, that very separation was what made true leadership possible. He claimed that his youth had only amplified the horror in people's minds that had he been a man, his actions might be viewed as harsh but necessary. But because he was a boy, they saw only evil. He did not weep, did not beg, and did not attempt to endear himself to anyone. He simply asked the court to consider whether a mind that could prevent greater destruction was not worth preserving. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted. Some demanded execution. Others demanded institutionalization. A few, though very few, questioned whether Jonas had truly acted alone, or if he had merely been a puppet for others, perhaps educated men who had used his appearance to mask their own ambitions. But no such accomplices were ever found. Investigators combed through his correspondence, examined his maps, and interrogated his family and peers. In every instance, they found the same answer: Jonas had worked alone. His plans had been his own. His methods, his handwriting, his voice. Ultimately, the court ruled that he was to be imprisoned indefinitely, placed under constant observation in a secured wing of the colonial asylum. It was considered a compromise between execution and mercy. The governor, visibly shaken after reading Jonas's journals, remarked that death might have been kinder not to Jonas, but to the minds of those forced to listen to him. When Jonas was transferred to the asylum, he did not resist. He brought with him only one item, a small wooden box containing miniature figurines carved in the shapes of kings, soldiers, and peasants. The box had a false bottom, beneath which was found a folded piece of parchment with a single line written in Latin, "Fiat lux ex mort, let there be light from death." His time in the asylum was marked by long periods of silence, punctuated by sudden bursts of intense activity. Doctors reported that he would go weeks without speaking, then spend hours sketching battle plans, alternative histories, or elaborate codes that no one could fully decipher. One physician claimed Jonas had predicted a major flood in the Southern Territories by analyzing rainfall patterns in old almanacs. Another reported that he once overheard Jonas muttering combinations of names and dates, some of which later aligned with unexplained disappearances along the frontier. Whether these were coincidences or further evidence of his unsettling awareness remained unclear. Jonas's influence didn't disappear after his confinement. Pages from his journals were secretly copied and circulated among certain militia circles, where some still viewed him as a misunderstood genius. Rumors surfaced that other young boys in distant towns had begun mimicking his behavior, referring to themselves as sons of order. The blindfolded angel symbol appeared carved into trees again, years later, near sites of fresh violence. Some claimed it was copycats. Others whispered that Jonas had found ways to continue his work from inside, perhaps through coded messages or hidden networks that no one had yet uncovered.